Today, I'm delighted to welcome Nick Dalton, co-author of The HR Revolution and formerly EVP of HR at Unilever, to the Digital HR Leaders podcast. Nick, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to chat to you today about all things HR and how it can help drive business. But before we get started, could you share a little bit about you and your background?
Yeah, David, thank you. And it's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So, I was in Unilever for 35 years. I sort of did every single job there was to do in HR, I think, including introducing a PeopleSoft system at one point. That wasn't my best hour, to say the least. I also did a little bit of time in production supervision, but I think I was costing far too much money, so they got me back into HR rather quickly. And my favourite, actually, HR job was when I was factory personnel manager at a factory in Grimsby, making fish fingers. But I did all the jobs, and latterly, just before I retired, I led the Future of Work programme at Unilever. Prior to that, I was basically EVP HR for Europe and for global HR partnering. So I used to say to Lena Nair, who I know has been on this podcast before, that I did Europe Monday to Sunday, and the rest of the time I would look after global. Really pleased to be here, and really looking forward to learning something in our discussion today.
And I think we'll be touching on things related to future of work. I'm particularly keen to talk to you about the evolution of HR, and if this bits on the video, I highly recommend that anyone in HR and business leaders read the book that you co-wrote with Alan Watkins, The HR Revolution. So we're going to look at HR. We're actually going to look at how it started, where it is now, and where it is or where it should be heading. Obviously, you've mentioned 35 years experience in Unilever, certainly an organisation where HR is leading, not reacting, and co-author of the book, as I mentioned. How would you say the role of HR has changed over the last sort of century and up to now?
Yeah, so just before I left Unilever, I had this great opportunity, really. I was 20 years abroad, and then I came back to the UK, and Alan and I started to write the book. And I'm a bit of a politics and history geek as well as a HR geek. So for me, actually starting where HR started, or managing people, managing large groups of people started, and thinking about the past, the present, and the future of HR, it was really fun, to be honest. I did some research, drew on my own experience. And people say writing a book is painful, but it just seemed to flow through. And when you write a book or when you go into consultancy, I soon learned that alliteration is very important. So we came up with this concept of the 7 waves of HR, which are all beginning with P, surprisingly. Now, the first wave really does go back to the start of the Industrial Revolution. And I used to laugh when I used to present on the future of work, and then I used to start in 1830. There were some people in the audiences used to raise their eyebrows a little. What's this guy on? But actually, when you think about it, there's a lot of lessons that contextualize for us going forward. And as an HR guy, one of the questions I always used to ask myself, and we were trained to do in Unilever, was what problem are we solving for here? What is it we're addressing? Or what value is it adding, or what risk of value destruction are we avoiding? But what is it we're solving for? And if you go back to the start of the Industrial Revolution, it was the first time people had come together in large groups to work in that way. So people had come together in the military, but they hadn't really come together to make stuff in large groups. And up until then, work had been put out. So, people worked from home. But now they were working in massive mills, big factories. And the problem to solve was, how do you get people to turn up to work on time and not be drunk, basically? And the people's strategic answer to that, because HR didn't exist then, of course, it wasn't a term we used, was paternalism. So I was really surprised when I researched this, how many of the early industrialists had built model villages. It's quite remarkable. And in all the countries that were developing this sort of early wave of the industrial revolution. And I haven't come from Unilever, which of course Lord Lever had built Port Sunlight, which is, even if you visit it today now, it's in the northwest of England, it's close to Liverpool. The houses today are beautiful, absolutely beautiful. When he built that village at the turn of the last century, so about 1901, 1898 to 1902, I think it took him, the nearest city of Liverpool was a running slum. And yet when you visit houses today, they're still beautiful today. So he didn't do that alone. Cadbury did it, the Calvé family in the Netherlands, and we had the Lowell Mills in the USA. It was really quite remarkable. And of course, this solved for that problem. And the early days of the HR profession was welfare. And the Institute of Welfare Officers was set up in the UK, which was probably the first institute of its kind. And the role of the sort of people leadership was about providing the family figure, looking after people, making sure people were fit and healthy, making sure they could work effectively. Now, that was the first wave, and you actually still see it today. During COVID, you remember that horrible March 2020 when we all thought the world was falling apart?
Oh,
a
yes.
number of companies, Unilever included, took the paternalistic move. We will not make any redundancies during this time. We will carry on paying you your full wages. We will look after you. And so in that time where people needed and felt the need for care when they were scared, the paternalistic strategy actually was reborn. And it still exists in many parts of the world today. You still see it. But what happened in terms of the sort of developing world, I think, was when the first boom and bust cycles happened. And the sort of early industrialists became the early capitalists, and they couldn't afford paternalism anymore. Of course, they started to cut back and to try and get people to work harder. They started to flood their operations with nasty supervisors who typically, were quite aggressive. And this led to the rise of the trade union movement, and this led to the era of power. Because the new problem to solve wasn't getting people to work, it was to manage conflict in the workplace. And surprise, surprise, the Institute of Welfare Officers became the Institute of Labour Relations Officers. And this power approach to the workplace, it became called industrial relations. Again, you still see it today. You still see companies and organisations making power moves. It's the most common strategy in the world, actually, in terms of managing employee or industrial relations. Very, very prevalent in the United States, even today. And any of these hire and refire moves that you see, fire and rehire, I got that the wrong way round, or actions like sacking your workforce and bringing in temps, which we saw recently with P&O, classic power moves. So, again, a strategy that was born around the 1880s, 1890s as a sort of personnel, people strategy, a leadership strategy. Not by any means dead today, still alive, but an old way of thinking about managing the workplace. Then, probably after the Second World War, we all decided these power leaders weren't such a good idea. And, bear in mind, during that era was the era of Henry Ford, was the era of electricity development, we made great progress because of people taking charismatic and decisive action as leaders. But it ran its course, and it turns into a bit like egotism and almost dictatorship. And so we went through an era of process after the Second World War. This is where we decided that the problem to solve here was we didn't quite like the aggressiveness, the conflict, that we needed rules and regulations where everybody could understand where they stood. It was a reaction really to service men and women returning from the war. They weren't going to return to the old environment that was riddled with conflict or with egos or with big figures. And so the era of process was when functions were born, when multinational companies started to get their act together, start to build training centres. It was the era of job evaluation. It was the era of very much paying for the job. Leaders were seen as technical experts, or are seen as technical experts. Utility companies actually run best in this mode. I wish Thames Water for the UK listeners was running in that mode, to be fair. Because it worked really well for 30 years. The French call it, I won't give you my horrible French accent, but the French call it the 30 glorious years. It was the sort of era in the United States of the 50s and the sort of suburbs. And that era, I think, brought us a fair degree of stability. It solved the problem it was asked to solve, but like all of these waves, the upside gets met by a downside. And the downside again was around the end of the 1970s. It was a little too slow. You know, we had we had to talk to trade unions all the time and works councils, and it took ages, and the laws were too onerous, and we needed to innovate, and we needed to be faster, and we needed to pay for the job, not pay for the job, but pay for performance. And so it really politically, this was the Thatcher-Reagan era. And the problem to solve for in that era was, how do we bring back entrepreneurial spirit and innovation? And, you know, say what you like about the politics, to some degree that was done during that era. I went from, actually, one week I got called on a course. I was taken off to France for a week. And I went as a manager, and I came back as a transformational leader. Because this was the era that managers became transformational leaders. This was the era where my nice DB pension scheme became a DC pension scheme, but I got stock options and bonuses. Many of your listeners will maybe still be doing it, but the whole ranking and yanking and those horrible discussions at the end of every year where you have to identify the bottom 10% and the top 10%. You know, and in the first years, it's not difficult. By the time you've been doing it for 10 years or 20 years, it's like drawing teeth. So that whole era, again, brought positives, but the negatives came, and they really hit us around 2008 with the great financial crash. We saw, you know, the difference between the CEO's pay and the pay of the lowest earner, assuming you could identify the lowest earner, being excessive. We saw excessive use of temporary, precarious labour. You know, actually, if you go around the world, and anyone listening from Asia or India or Africa, the excessive use of temporary labour to drive down wages and conditions and labour rights. It had all gone too far. But yet this is where most businesses still are today, I think. And most business books that I read during my 30 years in HR, and I gave us lots of training, you could see the worldview was either the profit worldview. We all worshipped Jack Welch of GE, thought he was great. We all did the Ulrich model, which is very much a child of that era for HR. Or the process era, which was Drucker. You know, we all loved the Drucker stuff. At least I'm old enough to have loved the Drucker stuff. The power eras, when we wanted to read about Henry Ford or Lee Iacocca or the latest, you know, great man of business. Or the paternalism era, where we tried to learn from what Lever did or Cadbury did or Wedgwood did or whoever it would have been. And actually, I think when you read most of the books today about change management or about HR, they're all those worldviews. But from 2008, we started to see another worldview emerge, which was the people wave. Now, what you'll notice here, David, is quite interesting. You notice the way the HR name changes. So I was a industrial relations manager. I'm old enough. I was then a personnel manager because I got promoted, and that was a more senior job at the time. And then one Wednesday afternoon, I was in Grimsby, and I got a phone call from my boss. They said, "Oh, you're now called an HR manager." I thought, well, that's good. Of course, I didn't realise it was deeply ideological. It was. But at the time, it was just a snazzy American title. But have you noticed now everyone's calling themselves people officers? Chief people officers. Yes, because we're now in the people wave. Or at least leading edge companies are in the people wave, or companies that are actually in the profit wave like to think they're in the people wave. So we're now using this terminology. And the people wave is really, I think, in most large organisations now the leading edge practice, but it is fundamentally unstable. So whereas in the profit wave, lunch was for wimps, in the people wave, we give people time off to meditate. And diversity and inclusion is a real thing, as opposed to having to make a business case for it. It's now seen as you do it because it's the right thing to do. Well-being is an important agenda. So you see that agenda change to sort of team-based pay. You see loads of large companies getting rid of ranking and yanking. You see that move around in terms of that, we all went too far now and we've got to put people first. But my fear of this and my experience of this is it's fundamentally unstable. Because companies during this era will often talk about purpose. I think it's more values than purpose. And You're faced with the reality that on Tuesday your CEO's standing up and saying what a wonderful business you are, what you're doing for the environment, how you're making a positive social impact. And on Thursday you're managing 2,000 redundancies. And there's this massive say-do gap. And I lived that for about 10 years because Unilever were very, very strong, still are very, very strong in terms of social impact and sustainability. And I've left now, but I know it's true, it's believed, it's genuine, it's part of the strategy. But the say-do gap is there anyway, no matter how much people believe it, no matter how good people's intent is. And the reason the say-do gap's there is because the world's just complex. It's just really difficult. If you want to address issues like child labour, it isn't as easy as just saying, we're going to stop using the people who do child labour when you find out, because the children could be then, quotes, disappeared. What do you do about that? How do you deal with that complexity? How do you deal with a world where all of your competitors, including the national government, are using labour that have to send their kids out to work because you don't pay them enough? But within that system, if you try and change that, you'll not be able to get your proper margin. And if you don't get your proper margin, then you can't pay your proper dividend, your stock price falls, people run it through the DCF calculations, and you end up with a takeover bid from a company half your size. What do you do about these things? So people era, I think, is probably where companies like Unilever are currently in, and it's fundamentally unstable. And I'm going to finish in a minute. I know this is a long answer to your question.
No, this is really good, because I think it's important. I'm like you, I'm a keen student of history, and if you want to understand the present and what might happen in the future, we need to understand where we've come from, don't we? So,
well, I think it does, because I think knowing where we've come from then allows us to sort of speculate about where we might go. Exactly. Now, we're not going to be right. And when I present this stuff, I always say at the start, look, this stuff's wrong. Because it can't be right, is it? The world's just too complex and no one can predict the future. And in fact, people who are a bit too sure of themselves about predicting the future normally end up messing things up. But I think it gives us questions we can ask. And it gives us lenses to look through. And I think that's the thing. And, this is also very Hegelian, if those are interested in philosophy. It's very much based on a progressive view of history. Now, I hope that to be true, because that's emotionally what I'd like to think. But, the conservative philosophers and John Grays of this world, Michael Otshots, would say, that's not true. Like, maybe some of the stuff's cyclical, but the world's not that ordered. We human beings are always looking for narrative, and there's not a narrative there. Both of those things could be true. Emotionally, I prefer this narrative. So, I hope that we will transcend the people wave and go into the paradox wave.
Yeah.
Now, the paradox wave is where we actually accept that we live in a world that you're going to make the Tuesday, Thursday thing happen. The Tuesday, you'll be trying to do something good. And on Thursday, you'll be looking after your business basics. You're going to have to do both. We are in a world where we're going to have to manage decentralisation and centralisation. This is the the holy grail of organisational design, it was always called. But the paradox wave is where I think we start to systemically and gradually solve for some of these issues. Now, no one is doing it, in my view, yet. Systems thinking becomes important. We'll talk about the training needed later on. And this is the era where networks, agile organisation, sharing workers, working with companies of similar purpose to build communities so that you can all change quicker when you need to change. All of the things we speak about in terms of job shares, job swaps, all of this type of stuff, different ways of thinking about organisation, functions disappearing and things becoming end-to-end, all of that stuff will work in this era. It doesn't work in any of the other eras. So I do laugh when people are doing agile, the Agile Manifesto movement. And they do agile. Agile works in the paradox era. But if you try and apply agile in the process era, it's just another process. And if you apply it in a profit era, well, people will run rings around it anyway because they just don't want to be disciplined. And if you apply it in the people era, it just takes ages because you've got to wait for everyone to have their say. It's designed for agile. And one of the things for us in HR, I think, is to use the right tool in the right place at the right time during the right wave. Yeah. Not the wrong tool for the wrong wave at the wrong time. And we're seeing the paradox stuff come alive. I first read Peter Senge's Fifth Discipline when I was back in Grimsby in the early 90s. And honestly, David, I didn't understand a word of it. I thought, what's everyone going mad about this book for? Then I read it 10 years later when I was doing work building a regional marketing organisation in Rotterdam for Unilever in ice cream. I thought, well, this has got some good stuff in it for workshops and stuff that I can take out, bring networks together. Then I read it again about 5 years later when I started to get involved with these paradoxes with Unilever. And I thought, my God, this stuff's great. This stuff has given me a completely new way of reframing these issues. And as an HR guy, you're not an HR guy anymore when you're doing that. You're involved with the complex solutioning. You're not involved with the HR outcomes. And that's called change management in my view, but you can't manage change. It's called change surfing. I think after the paradox wave, now this will happen, I think, after I'm dead. So let's, get really depressed here. I hope if we can go through the paradox wave, I hope we'll get to the planet wave. And the planet wave, I have no idea. In the book, Alan and I wrote a chapter on the planet wave, but in all honesty, it's blah, blah. If I was writing the book again, maybe for the second edition, we would rewrite that chapter. We've learned more since. Yeah. But the planet wave, I think, is about where we start to regenerate the planet, not exploit or extract. I think it will involve completely new business models than the ones we've had today. Or let me call them organisational models, because I think the concept of business will change. I like to sort of dream that human consciousness will be developed higher than our human consciousness has been developed today. And I do like to think human consciousness and sophistication is on an upward spiral. 100 years ago, the equivalent of Britain's Got Talent was dogfighting. So we must be doing something right as a society over time. So I hope the planet wave will come alive. I hope it will be about regenerating the planet. But I believe we've got to go through the paradox wave to get there, because we need to create the types of leaders who can do that, the types of organisations that can face into the level of complexity that will be required. And I think most business thinking today stops at the people wave. So since I was finished at Unilever, I've been spending my time doing two things: helping companies think about how they could navigate people and paradox, and also trying to learn what companies and organisations are doing so I can flesh out what this paradox planet thinking might be. Not to necessarily know the answers, but to know the questions.
Yeah. And a lot of it starts with the right questions, doesn't it? Whether it's so let's spend a bit of time on the paradox wave now, because as you said, although there are companies talking like they are close to or maybe even at the early stages of that wave, I think the reality is, as you've explained, Nick, that most, even the more progressive organisations, are still in the people wave and dealing with the complexity, as you said, that of operating in a people 2 days a week and a profit wave that 3 days a week as well. And the paradox, as you said, is about combining the two in the way I understood it, at least.
Yes.
So with the pandemic, obviously the huge advancements in technology and AI, I mean, even since we spoke of a couple of months ago, there's been more talk about generative AI and how that's going to change work and change HR. I think it's fair to say the world of work is changing pretty rapidly. How will a paradox HR function help businesses navigate during this change of time uncertainty? And there's a great quote in your book that you said that one of your purposes of the book is that it's a call to arms for HR professionals to stop following and to start leading, effectively, or stop reacting and start leading.
Yes. So if you're going to call yourself a profession, I think you have to have an underlying purpose.
Yeah.
And the HR function, I think, is a function today rather than a profession. I think we become a profession when we do have a point of view and the ability to prosecute a point of view. Now, that doesn't mean to say we all do the same things in our companies. But I think what it means is that we are able to analyse companies using similar frameworks, understand what best practice is, and to be able to have conversations that allow us to sort of embrace complexity and embrace difference without it being something that is a cause of conflict. So let me give you an example. For every wave, I think there's a series of not only HR, but leadership responses that are appropriate for that wave. So I often talk about managing change, and in the paternalistic wave, the way leaders manage change is to say, I'll look after you. And that's the strategy. In the power wave, the way people manage change is to say, just do it. Elon Musk classically, I think he's a paradox power thinker, but he applies the power wave in his organizational philosophies. In the process wave, we say, well, what's the process? We'll follow the process. We'll go through the Works Council, we'll do what the law requires, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll do the other. The profit wave leadership says, let me share my vision with you. Now, that works okay if my vision involves me keeping my job and maybe doing a little bit better, like it has for companies that have been growing. But the minute you're a company that's mature, that ends up, if I can misquote someone, with the grotesque chaos of comms departments spinning their own workforces, because it's just not authentic. The people wave is, let's ask the people. Classically Airbnb during COVID made people redundant and they said sorry and everyone said, oh, aren't they nice? Now that's fine. That is fine, and they did it very well. But, you're still making people redundant. Now, what I see is different types of leaders actually come forward with these worldviews during times of change, and they often confuse the hell out of the workforce. Because it might well be that actually the change needs to be done in a power mode because it's urgent and you've just got to do it. And you'll often get leaders up who can't do that, and they start talking, oh, we'll try and look after you, we'll try and do this, because they can't handle conflict. Or you get someone who goes over the top on conflict and ends up making everybody resist and respond in a way that causes strikes and slows everything down. Or the process wave, where people over-process it. Or the profit wave, as I say, where you're spinning your own workforce. Or the people wave, where you become paralysed. And so I think the role of HR is to recognise what wave your business is in, because I think actually these waves also follow business cycles and business growth. What that means for how you should do it, what that means for the types of leaders who need to lead for different things in the organisation. And the most sophisticated HR people actually will be able to probably run a number of waves going in a number of parts of their organisations at the same time. So it is the ability to integrate. It is not the centralised, one-size-fits-all corporate HR policy. It is, look, we're on a journey here. There's a series of best practices we need to use. There's a professional way of doing this. We want to change the world because we want to see the world get the planet. That's our professional instinct. But the way we change the world is to engage with businesses at every single wave, or multiple waves, and engage with leaders at every single wave and start to work that agenda. So in a paternalistic mode, if I was in a paternalistic company, I'd say, look, guys, don't start talking about purpose. This is about maintaining the family and the family traditions, isn't it? So let's tell people that. If I was in a power company, I'd say, well, let's not talk about purpose because we don't mean it. We're all about getting stuff done and making as much money or whatever it is that the owner wants to do that we're going to do. If we're in the process company, I'd say, let's not talk about purpose. Let's call it professional ethics or a code of business principles. In the profit era, I say, let's do a mission statement. Now, do you remember the mission statements in the profit era? They're all about winning and being the best. But that's appropriate for that era.
Yep.
If I'm the people era, I talk about a values statement, which I think is where a lot of companies have got to. They call it purpose, but I think it's more about values. And I think it's in the paradox wave where purpose actually comes alive, because then purpose is systemic. It's something you're doing in every bit of your organisation, every nut and bolt, every function. It's aligned, it's systemic, it's out there, and you're not doing it on your own, you're doing it with others. So I think HR needs to have that type of approach. And I don't know, David, if we want to talk about what HR looks like, because I think HR looks and organises itself differently. Not only does it call itself different things, but I think it looks and organises differently in each of those waves. So I think we need to be doing that. That's what we need to be doing. What problem are we solving for? Is it aligned? Is it coherent? What's the best practice? What's the upside of these waves? How are we going to move this organisation forward onto the next wave or waves? How are we going to develop the leaders who can do this? How are we going to change the way we talk to our employees? How are we going to reward people differently? How are we going to train people differently as we move through these waves?
Yeah, it's a good point. And actually, I think you've just preempted the next question there. If we think, and I appreciate that the companies are in different eras and in fact, sometimes transitioning between different eras depending on the problem that it is they're trying to solve or the business situation at the time. In terms of HR, how do you see HR looking, maybe if we look at the profit, people, and paradox eras. How do you see the HR looking different for companies that are in each of those eras?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be fascinating because it's whether the current cadre of us HR people are going to be the ones for the future or not. I think is still up for grabs. So look, the paternal era was welfare officers. It wasn't us. The power era was industrial relations people. People like me still have that skill, and it's still very common around the world, and it's still within the function. But in the power era, it was the only thing. In the process era, it was personnel, and that's where we started to take management development seriously and other associated sort of subspecialisms. The profit era was the Ulrich model, wasn't it, where we started to split the function apart into HRBPs, and I think we were rarely business partners, actually. Into service centres, which is now developing in terms of the whole employee engagement and becoming cross-functional and becoming more end-to-end and quite exciting.
And that's actually where most companies still are, isn't it? You know, they've still got the...
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And even so, a lot of companies are bringing stuff back in-house now because in a lot of cases, they lost that ability to connect with people, which actually is a strategic capability. You know, if you're seeing people every day and dealing with people every day, you start influencing people. I have something called the 2% rule. I joke that General Petraeus, the US counterinsurgency general who wrote the US counterinsurgency manual, stole it off me. Clearly he didn't steal it off me, but I claim he did. But I used to do it in Grimsby. There's 2% of the workforce, typically, who influence everyone else. You know, our job's to know who that 2% are and speak to them every week. That's how you influence the system. And I think, you know, a lot of places have bought some stuff back in-house because they lost that ability to influence the 2%ers. I don't know if they've done that consciously or unconsciously. So I think in the people era, what you're seeing is this sort of a little bit of confusion. Sort of it's all, what do we call it? Ulrich Plus, or, you know, and you see the McKinseys and the others and the Bains and all the rest of it start to model it. But it's a little bit confused. And I think in the paradox era, we are going to go what I would call a full modern day Premier League football, performance coaching. So when I was a kid, and I used to go to Spurs, I still do go to Spurs.
Sorry about that.
And they, yeah, yes. Well, this is why you learn to live with paradox. But that's another. I've got slides on football and waves, but that's another presentation, David. So when I used to go in the 70s and the 80s, and a player got injured, you know, some fat bloke with a cigar, with a cigarette coming out of his mouth, and a sponge would run on the pitch. You know, and they'd sponge this poor chap off and they'd sort of mishandle him off the pitch. Now, nowadays, if you look at, say, Jurgen Klopp at Liverpool or whoever, these guys now are supported by throw-in coaches, nutritionists, psychologists, you name it. And the role of the football manager is to draw on these specialisms, some of which they employ directly, some of which they contract in, to ensure that their squad of 25 people are at the highest level they can be. I think that's the role for whatever we call HR moving forward. You know, a lot of the stuff we did in the process era will be done end to end by service organisations who will take advantage of AI, be cross-functional and manage the whole piece around making sure that the hygiene factors and the engagement factors are in the right place that allows us then to operate effectively. And from there on in, I think the strategic HR person, I don't think will be called HR in the paradox era. I think will be called integrators or coaches. I think it'll be a different term. We'll run this sort of performance leadership piece. And I used to joke actually when I used to talk to these sort of young HR people in Unilever, and you get the earnest question at the end. When you do these speeches, you know, you suddenly realise you're old, and it hadn't really struck me before. When I was doing these sessions, and people say, "What would you recommend that we do?" And first of all, I used to give a very earnest answer, and then I used to say, "No, I think you should train to be a doctor." And you see everyone go pale. I said, "Well, why not?" Because my co-author, incidentally, Alan Watkins, is a doctor. Because what we're about is human beings. We're about human performance. So why aren't we looking at physiology? Now, obviously, we wouldn't look at physiology. Why aren't we looking at physiology? I mean, actually, in the people era, we are a little bit. And in the paradox era, leaders who can do paradox are going to have the top level of coaching and support in order to manage that and the complexities. So one of the books I recently read about a year or two ago, bought at Schiphol Airport, was Behave by Sapolsky. It's a big interdisciplinary book about the human being. Every HR person should read that, because that's what Paradox HR is going to. That's the book you need to read to do Paradox HR. And when I was back in Unilever, with Placide and others, and I used to say to the HR team that reported to me, guys, are we sure we are Paradox people, not process people? Because actually that process space is also developing its ways forward into the whole employee engagement area with the use of AI, with the use of tech. There's some really sexy stuff there. But it's going to be different. It isn't going to be Jurgen Klopp. It's going to be it's going to be one of the teams that supports Jurgen Klopp. Mm. The people analytics team is going to be the data analytics team that's supporting Jurgen Klopp. So I think it's going to go that direction. I think the world of sport, the world where human beings have to really stress their performance, is the places to look to see how, those people who support those people doing that are going to have to develop our game.
Yeah, and I guess if we need, to move performance, we need to understand performance. We need to understand what drives performance, how to improve. And as you said, that's where analysts come in. That's where behavioural psychologists come in. And we're seeing some of those areas growing in HR. Certainly, but there's going to be more people with those skills, aren't there? And they're not just the people that can do the analysis, but the people that can take the insights from the analysis and then coach leaders in the sort of paradox era. So, quite fascinating, really. And I guess we're seeing the early signs of it. One question, Nick. Again, it struck me when I was looking through the book this morning before we spoke. Unilever has got a pretty good reputation in HR, Lena, but not just Lena when Lena was there, but Lena and the whole leadership team, I've met many of them over the years. And there's no way that group of people or individual are followers or reacting. They have been leading and helping the organization evolve. Why do you think you were able to do that at Unilever? And what advice would you give to HR professionals listening who are maybe more in a reactive mode so they can actually start leading?
Look, I think we've been lucky in Unilever, those of us who sort of practiced our profession there, because when you think about the waves and you think about the history of Unilever, Lever built this village that was remarkable. He was probably the richest man in the world at the time, to be fair. But so he started with a clear point of view. He invented pension schemes and things. It was quite remarkable. So immediately the HR, what we call the HR function today, the sort of the people bit, was at the front of Lever's agenda. And obviously when you go into the power era, I don't know whether many of your listeners will be old enough, but there was a time during the power era where the big classic, the real, sexy job was the person who dealt with the trade unions, at least in the UK and in Northern Europe. That was, they were the guys. And Unilever went through that period. When I started in Unilever, unless you could manage industrial relations, you were a nobody in the eyes of both your colleagues and in the eyes of the line. And, when you're handling difficult industrial relations situations, and we did do, the line does get respect for you because, believe it or not, a lot of line managers are scared of that stuff. They really are. And so Unilever has always been, in terms of a business that's put the people agenda strategically. It's always been strategic. So we've always had a place at the table. This whole place at the table debate, I used to watch, it's always been there. Every general manager in Unilever would talk about their co-pilots, which was the finance person and the HR person. I was an HR person, but I wasn't. I was doing this stuff. I was managing and thinking about complex change. And the other point, David, which I think people often overlook, is some of the processes are really important. So Unilever runs every year an HR planning process where every single leader is discussed at different levels of the organisation. So you will have the CEO of the company spending a huge amount of time meeting with each of the business units to go through their top 100 managers. Now, what I found, and this is a little bit of the sort of power leadership piece, when your line colleagues know you're at that table, it enough help. I mean, believe me, it really helps. So if I was wanting to sort of cement an HR organisation into place, one of the first things I would do is putting an HR planning process to make sure that I had a seat at the top table, which was discussing people's careers. You'll be amazing, Lynn, how many phone calls you get when people know that. How many people want to speak to you? When I was doing the supply chain, I did the global supply chain and had to do industrial relations. And it was there was some dreadful industrial relations problems, and line managers would really go on, or sometimes really, I can understand the pressures they were under. But when they know you're sitting with the chief supply chain officer deciding who gets what promotion and drawing up a succession plan, and I've helped them taking your advice.
Yeah.
So, luckily for us in Unilever, we walked into that environment, that context. And it allowed us to, I think, practice the profession of HR, not just do an HR job. Mm-hmm. It's why Unilever is a great place to be an HR professional.
Yeah. No, it's good. Some good points there, Nick. So thinking then about HR and thinking about trying to shift into the paradox era, sort of two parts of this question. You've talked a little bit about this, but maybe a little bit more. What does a paradox leader look like, and how can HR help develop these leaders?
Yeah, so I think the people often say to me, how many paradox leaders have you met? Can you name some? And honestly, in business, it's difficult because I think the business world is still very much in this people wave at tops. I think some companies are experimenting with paradox, but it's very early days. So people say to me, what does a paradox leader look like? I often refer them to the film Invictus. I don't know, David, have you seen the film Invictus?
I haven't actually, no.
Well, it's worth watching. So it's a Hollywood film, stars Matt Damon and Morgan Freeman. And it's a dramatisation of the South African rugby team winning the Rugby World Cup. Now, at one level you think, all right, okay, it's a sports film. Well, it's not. It's a film about paradox leadership. Because I won't put any spoilers in, but everyone knows what probably happened. But if you don't know what happened in that, it makes it even more exciting. But Morgan Freeman plays Nelson Mandela. And, honestly, it's a superb illustration of what being a paradox leader looks like. Absolutely superb. The final paradox in the film for me is this guy was jailed, 25, 26 years by the regime. The regime who basically represented themselves through the green shirt of the Springback rugby team. And he wears that top. Now, there's a paradox for you. So what we need to develop are the Nelson Mandelas of the business world. So, easy said, difficultly done. But it's more complex than that as well, because not everybody needs the paradox wave leader now.
No.
There's lots of parts of our business, lots of parts of the world of Unilever needed the power leader or the paternalistic leader or the process leader or the profit leader, depending what was going on in the phase. The key is getting the right type of leader. And of course, it's not this simple, is it? No one's one thing. It's just where, So I think the paradox leader is a leader who can genuinely lead without hierarchy, lead through networks, doesn't have the ego where they need to be praised. Is the invisible hand leader who's incredibly effective. And that's, again, the paradox of the paradox leader, because people don't see them as leaders because they're doing stuff in the background. This is the paradox. The people leader, we all know, is the people leader is very nice to people. And often when a people leader enters an organisation for the first time, everyone loves them. And then they're very disillusioned with them by year 2 because, they don't really get anything done. But they have lots of nice discussions, which is good. And some organisations, by the way, need that for a couple of years before they can move on. The profit leader, we all know well. It's the GE, it's the let me share my vision with you. It's the whole American, business school playbook. The process leader, dreadfully undervalued. These people are the experts who really know their stuff and actually make the cogs of the machine work and deliver on the physical stuff, on the stuff that matters. I mentioned Thames Water, utility companies in general. They moved from this process era to this profit era when they were privatised, and it's a mess because they should be process. And then you have the power era, and you do need the power. Power era is what you need during blitz scaling if you're a smaller company. It's what you need if you've got a crisis. It's what you need, frankly, if you are dealing with a situation with corruption and bad behaviour and you need to go in and sort it. But to develop paradox leaders, I think, I wanted to do this in Unilever, but we could never get to it. I used to have an annual medical. I would like an annual leadership medical, where my levels of leadership, my leadership development is worked on. Because I think leaders are made. They're not born. Leaders are made. And I think if I was in an organisation, even if it's a power organisation, that's probably where I'd like to manage it from. Well, I'd be developing leaders who could handle more complexity over time, bit by bit by bit by bit by bit. And, in terms of sort of very, very classically, in terms of training and development, things like that, when you think about it, the history of training, I'm just trying to remind myself, in the paternalistic era, the training everybody did was really safety focused. In the power era, the training was really about training supervisors to manage, type X or type Y way. That was all the stuff then. Apprenticeships were the key thing. Process was about functional training. Profit was all of us going away to be transformational leaders. It was the competence era as well, because attributes started to become important. In the people era, we were all being trained in well-being and diversity. All of those are really important. I think in the paradox era, it's systems thinking that we add to that mix. And I think also individual coaching has to become really important. People have to be coached through these levels and stages in order to be able to develop as paradox leaders.
Actually, one thing listening to Nick, it's, basically now, if we're thinking that some companies are striving to get into the paradox era. So that's 6 eras that have gone, and with an eye on maybe the planet era that you were talking about as well, which is maybe somewhere in the future. So essentially, as a leader, you're effectively having to transition between all those different phases, depending on the problem it is you're trying to solve. So actually, that by definition, that means that leadership is getting more complex because you've got to be more adept at being able to transition between different eras depending on what the problem is you're trying to solve. And then as HR professionals, that's more complex for us because to actually guide leaders to take the right mode is harder as well. So So maybe that's why. I mean, this is just a hypothesis based on listening to you. Maybe that's why companies are struggling to truly transition into the paradox era. Although that's clearly what in many businesses is required at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, this stuff is complex, isn't it? I mean, I've spoken with great confidence about all of these waves and everything else. And as I say, I'm absolutely acutely aware it's probably wrong, but that's not the point. I think the point is the questions you ask. And I think as HR professionals, sometimes we think about, we've got to be able to give a view on marketing, or we've got to be able to give a view on this or that. Well, no, we're not really expert in it. But actually what we've got to be able to do is have a framework and a worldview where we can ask the right questions about all of these subjects and link things together. The function of HR is uniquely placed. It's HR and finance, actually, and a little bit of IT, but IT have never really played this space, where you're the integrators of the organisation. You can see across the organisation. And, that is really, really sort of a privileged position. And you can leverage it. But, when I was a young HR practitioner, I didn't have a clue how to leverage it. And it's as you get mature, as you develop, and as you get your frameworks, you get your point of views, you can then start asking intelligent questions. And once you can start doing that, you're part of the team. And then you start working with the individuals in your team to make sure they're the best they can be. And there's not a better job in the world, in my view, than doing that. You'll have seen it, David, as well, when you're working with a team, and I call it the spirit coming into the room. It's when suddenly everything clicks and bang, and that's when you're going to perform. That's the flow moment. And that's what we should do. That's what we're about. That's what we're about making. No one else does it. And if we don't do it, if we don't develop, out of process or out of profit, if we don't develop out of that, then someone else will do it because it has to be done.
No, really good, Nick. Really enjoying this conversation, and I think HR professionals listening hopefully should be absorbed in this conversation. We're getting towards the end, Nick, and this is the question that we're asking everyone in this series, and you certainly would have touched on it a little bit, but please feel free to sort of summarise as well here. I mean, it's could be quite a big answer. What is the role of HR in helping companies plan effectively for the future of work?
So remember, we went back to that sort of managing change piece where different leaders manage in different ways and we lead for different ways. I think that whole future of work agenda is about facing into the fact that work is going to change so quickly. And then even since we spoke last, David, which was only a couple of months ago, as you said, what's going on with ChatGPT and what's going on in terms of there's now, I think it's there, by the way, where you can put up all the data from the ERP system and your employee surveys, get it crunched by ChatGPT and get you insights. I think it's there. I think that's going to, I think it's there. Now, I think in sort of this world, what we've got to do is prepare our workforce, not by saying we'll look after you, not by saying just do it, not by saying follow the process. We'll have to follow the process. We'll have to do it, and we'll have to do our best to look after people. But that's not the messaging. Not by saying we'll share our vision with you, but by the way, you lose your job and there's only 10 of us left. Not by saying to everybody, sorry. But what we're going to have to do is say to people, we're going to face into this. Now, I think part of that solution is we stop looking at managing change within silos of our individual companies. We start looking at managing change within a wider community aspect with networks of other companies so that we can share employees, we can share training opportunities, we can share agendas. We start measuring change as a community resilience measure as well as a company resilience measure. And we start to really commit to people's livelihoods. Up until now in the Industrial Revolution, the employment contract's been transactional. You come to work, we'll give you money, you go home. Well, I think now the employment contract's got to be developmental, or actually more empowering. It's not even developmental, it's a bit top down. It's got to be about empowering people. But not only empowering, because I don't buy it's up to the individual. We've got to empower people within the collective concept, which will involve the government sector, the voluntary sector, the trade unions, and the private sector. And it's only paradox leaders and paradox thinkers who will have the ability to pull those systems together. Traditional leaders will fail to do that. So we as HR, I think, need to look for the opportunities where we can manage change in a paradox way. Be wise enough to understand that there are types and parts of the world and certain circumstances where you can't. Choose the right way of doing it, and then managing it with a view to the future, not with a view to the past.
No, really, really, really profound and great, I think, advice there, I think, for people listening as well. I love that view. So Nick, I can't believe we've already come to the end of our conversation. Time does definitely go fast when you're learning, and I definitely learned a lot in the last sort of 45 minutes or so. So finally, Nick, thanks for being a guest on the show. Can you let listeners know how they can find you on social media, find out more about your work, and find out more about the book, The HR Revolution, as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, the book's available on it's a Routledge, and of course it's available on Amazon. The best way to get me on social media is LinkedIn. So I don't know, David, as I've entered this world of consultancy, I sort of realised I'm a content guy, I'm not a seller. So I'm sort of LinkedIn, and that's about it on social media, which is exactly what you shouldn't be doing, I suppose, but that's what I do. Because I like to spend my time on the content, and I like to work with businesses that are grappling with these complexities, because I think you get points for trying, to be honest, in today's world. And it's important to try.
LinkedIn and Twitter, and I'm only just about on Twitter, so okay. We're probably of a similar era, Nick. So we don't do TikTok and other stuff. We'll leave that to our kids.
No.
Leave that to our kids. All right, Nick. It's been an absolute delight to speak to you, and look forward to hopefully seeing you again and having another conversation as well. So,
David, it's been great, thank you, and I'd be really interested in any learnings and feedback people are having, any thoughts about how we can make the paradox wave, more practical.
Great. Well, there we are. There's an open invitation then for listeners to get in touch with Nick to talk about the paradox wave and how we can make it more practical. Nick, thank you very much. Look forward to speaking again soon.
Thank you.
In this series, we will be speaking to a range of senior leaders who are pushing a data-driven and digital HR agenda. Make sure that you subscribe via your podcast app of choice and also via our YouTube channel for free and regular interviews with the digital HR leaders of the future.